The Rhodesian Bush War. Just mentioning it probably gives some people the urge to start typing intensely partisan viewpoints about the country and the war itself, either being strongly in favor of Rhodesia or extremely against its existence. Either way, please keep your politics to yourself. There are other places to complain online about these things, and my channel definitely isn't one of those places. Now I'm about to completely alienate probably both sides in this alternate history video in some way, shape, or form. So shut up, keyboard warriors, history is complex, and in the end, everyone lost the Rhodesian Bush War. Throughout the 1950s, Rhodesia began shifting from white minority rule towards majority rule at a gradual pace as the late 1950s and early 60s came around. Two political hardliner factions, being ZANU and ZAPU, which had their own militant wings, waged a guerrilla war against Rhodesia, and they were ZANLA and ZIPRA. Ian Smith's government declared independence from Britain on November 11, 1965, and was unrecognized by essentially the entire world. The Rhodesian Bush War lasted from July of 1964 until December of 1979, where the ZANLA and ZIPRA militants began by raiding farms and conducted small-scale attacks in the early years of the conflict. These militants crossed into the borders of surrounding countries to hide and also made no attempt at winning the hearts and minds of the population. The militants sucked so bad that they then sent in guys to the Soviet Union for training and received aid from Maoist China. Keep in mind, that'll be important later. The Rhodesians were winning the Bush War pretty easily due to their military's professionalism and just how poorly the militants conducted themselves. However, in 1968, things escalated with Portugal losing much ground in Mozambique, where anti-Rhodesian rebels held bases to make Rhodesia face a guerrilla war on three fronts. Portugal would still provide Rhodesia with support until 1974, but Portuguese aid would go downhill in 1968. Additionally, ZANLA and ZIPRA committed mass terrorist actions against Rhodesian civilians, regardless of race, which I won't get into detail about because YouTube probably wouldn't like it. For example, instances along the Zambian border saw ZANLA militants attacking villages, kidnapping children for indoctrination, enact terror bombings and mass killings in the region to prevent Rhodesian security forces from following them. Also, militants would shoot down civilian airliners and conduct mass massacres during the war. In the 1970s, during the war, ZANLA and ZIPRA even got to the point to where they fought one another as much as they fought against Rhodesian security forces due to internal divisions over a few things, notably being between which form of communism each group followed, with ZIPRA following Soviet ideology and was exclusively backed by the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, ZANLA followed Maoist ideology and found an ally in the People's Republic of China. Sanctions were also a massive hit on Rhodesia's ability to wage war against the guerrillas and isolated Ian Smith's government on the world stage to only have South Africa and Portugal as allies, which weren't really the best states to be allied with when waging a war in Africa at the time, as Portugal was also isolated due to their own wars in Africa, and also South Africa was an apartheid state, so that really didn't help Rhodesia's image of just fighting a war against communism. Meanwhile, ZANLA and ZIPRA played up the racial undertones of the war and, like I said before, were supported by outside states. Rhodesia, however, did have one major ace up its sleeve, and that was the Rhodesian Armed Forces. To name a few units, the Rhodesian Light Infantry, Salos Scouts, Rhodesian SAS, and Rhodesian African Rifles were extremely effective at waging a war of counterinsurgency, as the Rhodesian military never really lost a battle. The Rhodesian Air Force also made sure that their ground troops had air supremacy. However, despite having many operational successes, the war was lost as a result of many political factors. You see, Rhodesia was essentially cut off from the rest of the world, and the Rhodesian Security Force uses of chemical and biological weapons during the war really didn't help them out at all. Furthermore, in 1976, Rhodesian forces conducted a cross-border raid into Mozambique to target a rebel training camp, which killed 1,000 people and was strongly criticized by the international community. Additionally, South Africa withdrew its support for Rhodesia and left the country fully on its own as a result of this raid. And of course, Rhodesia had declared independence from Britain, which wasn't recognized by anyone, as Ian Smith had still kept Rhodesia as a minority rule country at the time. Conditions that would need to be changed to produce a Rhodesian victory against ZANLA and ZIPRA would be, first, if Rhodesia's declaration of independence from Great Britain was recognized by other countries such as the United States. But that would only be able to happen if Ian Smith decided to immediately put Rhodesia into the transitional phase to become a majority rule state, which is something that in our timeline Rhodesia was just unwilling to do, so therefore sanctions remained. Changes would also have to occur regarding the sanctions to increase Rhodesia's ties to the international community. Although Britain would still remain pretty mad at Rhodesian independence, this would allow for Rhodesian grievances against Zambia and Mozambique regarding Zanla and Zipra guerrilla bases to be heard. Additionally, Rhodesia would be able to purchase weapons from states other than just Portugal and South Africa, which will also boost the country's image among their own population. The internal communist struggle between Zanla and Zipra would also have to be heightened earlier on in the Bush War compared to when it happened in our timeline to further discredit the militant groups and show that communism sucks. Zanla and Zipra's conflict with one another undermined their war efforts, and it also ensured that Mugabe, a proper moron, would come out on top. Either way, in this alternate timeline, the internal conflict sees them fight each other from the start because of the Sino-Soviet split, and communism tends to not do so well when there are other branches together. Since Rhodesia has begun the transition to majority rule as a condition to win the political battle of the war, the country can now paint the conflict as one of the government fighting against communist rebels and gangster terrorists, instead of allowing for the perception of a race war to be used as effective propaganda by Zanla and Zipra. Furthermore, fighting against communists will allow for aid to come to Rhodesia from NATO countries such as the US. But this is also on the condition that Rhodesia does not use chemical and biological weapons in the war. Rhodesia's transitional phase in reality saw the country change its name to be Zimbabwe Rhodesia in 1979 and hold elections that were criticized for apparently being rigged. But politics here was extremely chaotic and complicated, so I won't really get into it. The country also sort of became a British colony again until 1980, when it officially became the independent Zimbabwe state, where Robert Mugabe was elected, and although things appeared pretty good at first, Mugabe became a tyrannical dictator whose economic and racial policies would soon destroy much of the country. In this alternate transitional phase, Zimbabwe Rhodesia will present itself as continuing the earlier gradual civil rights policies, but now has a more hastened pace. Civil rights will be granted to all in the mid-60s, as the Rhodesian Bush War will become another African Cold War conflict between East and West, as the rebels hold various communistical ideological viewpoints, but hold that thought for a moment. Impacts on neighboring states will see Zimbabwe Rhodesia have a pretty negative relationship with countries like Mozambique and Zambia over the issue of Zanla and Zipra rebels, to the point of eventual more cross-border raids still occurring. This leads to strained future relations with the two countries for a while. However, Rhodesia Zimbabwe would probably still work with Botswana over these issues and start to have a good relationship there. During the Cold War in Africa, proxy wars still occurred as the Soviets, Chinese, Cuban, and other Warsaw Pact countries supported their own groups, while the US and NATO countries supported their own rebel groups against one another. But regarding the Bush War in this alternate timeline, the US supports Zimbabwe Rhodesia, while the Soviets back Zipra, and even more as the PRC sends even more support to Zanla. The war escalates as the three factions battle it out. But Rhodesia Zimbabwe is gonna win despite Soviet and Chinese attempts to extend the war even longer in low-level insurgency campaigns. But still, the security forces are gonna win, especially with the full backing of the United States and NATO countries. On post-war outcomes, it's unlikely that enhanced Chinese support for Zanla is gonna have any impact on Nixon's 1972 trip to China, nor is the war gonna impact détente with the USSR. But changes will really only be occurring in southern Africa. In the wake of Rhodesia Zimbabwe's independence and support from the West, Portugal might have an earlier Carnation Revolution, which would mean an earlier end to the Portuguese colonial wars, but also an earlier civil war in Mozambique and Angola to potentially occupy the Cold War powers. Also, South Africa might see more pushes to end apartheid, but that's not very certain. But one thing that probably will happen is that Zimbabwe Rhodesia's Central Intelligence Organization will still heavily back RENAMO against the Mozambican government. Other uncertainties are how the Rhodesian victory will impact the South African border war and the future Southwest Africa. Will it become Namibia? I just can't accurately predict that. Also, there's the First and Second Congo War, and I'm not sure how Rhodesia Zimbabwe's existence and alternate interactions with African states in the 1980s will affect those wars. The other big question is, will Zimbabwe Rhodesia last into the 21st century? Well, probably, unless internal politics of the state cause the country to fracture once again, but all of this is very uncertain and unknown for how to predict. This is of course just one possible scenario about if Rhodesia had won the Bush War. Be sure to keep things civil in the comments, as the Rhodesian Bush War was a complex historical topic. But what do you think would have happened? Do you also want me to cover more aspects of the war in my military history videos, as I was definitely not able to cover near enough in this video? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.